All right, let's take a look at one of these old SPI ones. This is a new game for me. Not a new game overall, obviously. It's printed in '78. I kind of picked it up with the thought of, well, I remembered a friend of mine had some folios of the old medieval quad. And I thought maybe this would be of the same nature. It's not. This came out a year before the Medieval's Quad did. And it is a much more detailed system, I think, and certainly very, very different ideas. The Medieval's Quad kind of feels a little bit like other games. In particular, something like Men of Iron doesn't feel that terribly different. Yes, there's the impulse and everything in there, the initiative segment. But this is a Dunnigan game where, he really kind of was designing something very new. In part maybe because of the strangeness of Agincourt, facing a battle where one side is outnumbered tremendously, yet almost inevitably should win the game. Now, as with the Men of Iron print and play Agincourt, the base battle should be, and I've read comments that it is, pretty damn unbalanced, with the English almost assured of victory. On the other hand, they provided a number of what-if scenarios here, including a free French deployment, which probably isn't going to help too much, but it prevents the French from having to follow the channeled movement, which is one of the factors in this. In a sense, the historical scenarios probably only really suitable for solitaire, just for a couple of reasons. One, that the French are going to get butchered, and two, that the French don't really have many decisions to make, at least early in the game. The other options, though, include one in which the English have to attack, which, had the French not allowed themselves to essentially be taunted into a charge by the archers, they, in terms of overall strategic situation, may have had to do. And then the final one is, had the French not, and whether or not this is truly the case may be somewhat questionable, but the battlefield was essentially chosen by the English in almost a formal manner. They didn't simply, at least the legend of the story is that the English and French heralds got together and the English made a request that the battle be here, essentially, and the French acceded to that. And that doesn't sound terribly believable to me. It sounds more like some of the glorification of chivalric ideals that probably I have a lot of doubt as to how much stock to put in them. Anyway, I'm trying to decide whether or not I want to run through this kind of overview side of things. I think I'm going to do it with the sequence of play. This is a game that, like with Triumph of Chaos, I don't really totally grasp at this point. So I'm going to be trying to explain the rules to understand the rules better. This is something I do. Unfortunately, with TOC, that wasn't enough. But here I think it will be. I don't think this is anywhere near as painful for me to approach. Okay, one thing this game is going to do is it's going to use percentile dice. Let me just throw a couple of 10-siders on the table for almost everything. And because this was written in 78 and percentile dice weren't that terribly common in the wargaming community, they still kind of aren't. They had to explain how to use them. Right. The first thing in the sequence of play, well, you're going to be alternating turns, player turns, and they're pretty much the same. So let's go to the first thing in the first player turn, which is a fugitive movement phase. There are these fugitive and dead body counters that are going to be all over the battlefield. And the French are going to determine which way their fugitives run. And for the large part, this is determined once when they're in the hex with the unit that they break off from. And then they just kind of run in a straight line from there. But if they run into something, they may change their decision. If they end up in the same hex as an enemy unit, they end up as captured forces instead. And that gives you more victory points. And I'm not quite sure how you mark captures. I assume we just write that down on paper. Okay, then we go to the player movement. Now, this is weird. They've built an impulse system into the game, but it's not any kind of attempt to make simultaneous movement. It's an I go, you go game. And so on the French turn, they're going to move all their units on one impulse that they wish to move. And then the English are allowed to fire their bows. And then the French move another impulse, and the English are allowed to fire their bows. I'm not quite sure how that's going to work. The English are allowed to fire up to 6 volleys from their long bows. The French can fire 4 from their short bows and 2 from their crossbows. This is in each impulse. Now, this is also limited by the ammo that's available in the various weapons. Everybody's got 24 ammo on board, each of their bowmen, although I know that the English have a second sheaf of 24 arrows. I'm not sure if the French also have that. And there's a possibility for the English to retrieve their arrows as well. That actual fire is going to be using this, the fire combat result table. And let's see what we do here. You choose a range and a number of volleys that you're going to fire. Now, at close range, this number of volleys seems to decrease to half, which I didn't realize. And then you're going to roll percentile dice to see how many hits you get. And I'm assuming, looking at the table, that this is a less than or equal to. So, for example, if I'm out here at 3 hexes, and this is where the bow is going to be at the most effective, actually, and I fire all 6 volleys over there, I get a strike on a 37 or less, but on a 38 to 48, I get 2 hits, and on a 49 or 50, I'm going to get 3 hits. And those hits are going to be assessed on the army strength levels on the unit you're firing on. So, for example, if I was firing on Alençon's men-at-arms, 3 hits would be recorded this way. And if I fall off the map, they completely are destroyed. Those hits are also going to generate fugitives and dead in the hex where they fall. And those things all are going to have effects. This is a little weird. Almost a minis type feel so far, but let's keep going. Then the French player is going to have to check morale for any units that remained in place and have been contacted by French fugitives. I think that's entered the same hex. If they move, or if they're adjacent to English combat units and are strong enough that they could melee them. And what you do for this, French archers, French third battle, all other units. Ah, gotcha. Okay, what you do with this is you compare the type of unit, whether it's French archers or French third battle. The third battle is this final line here, or everything else. And then how many lines does it have left? Now, the reason we have these different columns is the French third battle is the units are smaller, and they're actually 1 hex units, as are the archers. The English also will be rolling on the morale table. All their units are smaller, though, which I find kind of odd here. And what you do is you check the current line strength, you roll percentile dice, and I believe you pick up, if the number rolled is equal to or less than the indicated die roll, the unit suffers a line loss. Place a fugitive marker. So you're going to combine it to morale points, and I don't know what morale points are. Here we go. So you add these up. If you took an arrow strike, you're going to get certain points attached to you. If you are stacked with dead of the same nationality, or fugitives, or if you've lost your first 2 lines, you take a roll. You take additional points. If you're planning on meleeing, or if you lost 3 lines, you get that many points. And I think these are all cumulative. Cav, which will melee with an archer. When King Henry dies, or if you've lost 4 or more lines. And that'll give you a percentage chance when you combine the morale check, or morale points, with the number of lines that you currently have, which can indicate damage. Now that damage will be loss of lines, and they'll generate fugitives, but they don't generate dead. People aren't going to fall over dead from that. All right. Now, before you go to melee, if 2 adjacent units are stacked, are next to each other, and they have enemy leaders, those leaders engage in mano-a-mano combat, like in some of the samurai-style games. This is the first time I've seen this in a medieval game. I find it kind of interesting because it does kind of apply. You would have one known person essentially making a challenge on the battlefield, riding up to some other known person in that manner. And there would be a loss of face. Now that's not covered here. It was never as rigid as the samurai code. So if you ran from battle as a lord in medieval time, you wouldn't have to kill yourself. But in general, you would fight. So they take that general case here. Okay, then the French player will be conducting, and I should kind of explain the leader combat result. This is going to be an interesting situation. Basically, each player one player is going to be superior. That player is going to have the higher combat rating. And the ratings on a leader, I haven't explained the numbers at all. The leader has 2 numbers on him, his combat value and his ransom value. Now, his combat value is going to be used both for himself, but also for troop combat. Regular troops have where they're positioned in terms of setup, and then they have a melee strength, or they're archers. Now, archers on the back are going to have a melee strength, while the English do. I think the French archers do not. Cav units, on the back, they have a charging status, which will have a higher melee strength. And wanted to see if there's anything else. I got a cannon here. You can see that. The French had some small amount of cannons. That's an optional rule. All right. So for the melee, for the leader versus leader melee, whoever has the higher strength is going to be the superior combat, the superior force in the combat. Now, if both are equal, you do a more bloody combat where each gets a chance at it. Each player is going to pick a tactic, and they kind of randomize this in the solo game, at least for the French. And I'll do that. You pick a tactic, and you combine the two tactics to come up with a location to make a roll. If you succeed, what you do is you roll the percentile dice to see who, if any, take damage. Either the superior player can take damage, both players take a point of damage, or the inferior player takes a point of damage. And what I don't remember here, I think you fight it out until somebody dies, basically. Let's take a look at the rules for that, because I don't want to... I guess I'm kind of going more into the rules than I'd like to at this point, but we're just kind of doing that. You'll engage in 5 individual rounds during which the strength can be reduced. If the strength is reduced to 0, the leader is captured and removed from the map. And I think the strength is just a temporary reduction based on for the combat itself. I think you recover it all after your 5 rounds or whatever. There's no way out of it that I see except by losing. Well, that's kind of a little weird. Okay. All right, the next thing we do is melee attacks for forces. And this is going to be... let's see what we got. We got this melee combat results table with a differential. So you have to have enough points to get a differential of at least 0. If you don't have that, you don't even have to make a morale check for your melee prior to melee, which could be a good thing. And let's see, the following conditions are checked for in the melee adjustment table. Here we go. Okay. Crowded on 3 sides means you have your own units adjacent to you on 3 sides. Crowded on 2 sides, etc. Crowded on 1 side or per increment of dead marker in the unit's hex. So a pile of dead is bad for you as well. Now, what does it mean to be crowded? Crowding is just being adjacent to a friendly unit, and that can decrease you up to a maximum of -3. The dead can, I think a pile of dead can decrease your strength by any amount. You also get a bonus for your leader's combat rating. And different units, the first time that they attack in the game, if they moved immediately preceding movement phase, they get this bonus to their strength. The English also get a bonus if they're being attacked from behind the stakes, and that's these little red markers here that they've got set up, and they can pull them up and move them. If they're not being attacked through a flank hex side, then their melee strength is increased by 1. Okay, so casualties don't really affect your combat strength. You have these lines of combat ability, but as long as you have any lines of combat of unit left, you get your full combat strength, because that indicates a frontage. Those guys are just there to take losses, but they also affect your morale as they get eaten up. Let's see what else we have here. Okay. All right. Once you engage in combat, you're locked in combat until a unit is basically destroyed. Any defenders are going to have to check morale during the fatigue morale phase. Terrain has no effect. You can only do 1 melee combat in 1 attack during any melee combat phase. And you must do 1 if possible, if you can get a combat strength of 0 or higher. 2 units can combine their strengths. The French double-sized units, you can see this is one of the earlier games where they added these suckers. If they can't get both their sides into the battle, they have half the strength for the attack. But they have their full strength on defense, it looks like. Okay. So what you do in the combat is you're going to get a differential of the 2 strengths. Look at how many lines there are of the defender left, and then roll a percentile to see if the defender suffers line loss, and that'll cause a dead and a fugitive marker. Now you start to see something here. As long as we're fairly close in strength, a line can be broken apart early. But once you get down to the last lines, it's hard to finish off a unit. And that's kind of an interesting thing, because that's not the case with archery. The archery is able to fire and finish units off. So that's kind of weird there. And I'm not sure I'm comfortable with that. The number of rolled is equal or less than the die roll, the defending unit suffers a line loss. Yeah. So it's going to be very, very hard to kill off units that are at their last lines. I don't know why that would be done. We'll see how it actually plays out. I've seen people saying this is a fantastic simulation. I'm not sure I believe that. I think that's a little bit of tweaking to make things happen. And then essentially the non-phasing player has to check morale for all units which were engaged in combat in the opponent's melee phase. And you'll see the only real effect that I think you have with this, well, crowding is an effect there, right? Yeah. Crowding's going to still affect you. The dead are going to affect you. That's it. It doesn't look like having been in a melee is going to affect you. It's only being about to be in a melee. Okay. The cav penalty here, cav meleeing an archer, the reason for that is the stakes. If they're going through the stakes, chances are they can't make that attack. Okay. What did we miss? There's no stacking, except for a leader can stack. We didn't really go into movement. movement is actually kind of interesting here. There are some, first of all, you're facing a hex side, not a hex. Or a hex vertex, not a hex side. You don't have sort of a free movement ability. In fact, there's quite a few restrictions on movement. A French archer, for example, can't move next to any other unit. Nor may a French combat unit move next to a French archer. Now, the French archers are in the second line here, so they cause a bit of a problem. It costs you a movement point to reface your units. The double counters can move like this. That's how they turn. Or they can spend, I believe, a movement point to do a 180. All right. Special rules continue, though, to take care of the fact that the French are kind of backed up into 3 columns in their attack. Until units are successful in battle, French combat units must be moved in line formation, i.e. the whole line has to go. All of the units must spend the same number of movement points to move forward in the line, in any given line. You may not pivot. You can't do anything like that until you've destroyed an English unit in your path. Once you've successfully eliminated an English unit, then you can freely be moved and you don't have to worry about the line restriction with that unit. Any French unit which cannot be moved because it's blocked by an English unit can expend movement points to keep up with its line commitment at the end. This has no effect except to validate the line movement. A French unit must begin its movement phase in line with at least one other French unit to be subject to line movement rules. If its path is blocked, it may be forced to drop out of line, and hence it would no longer be subject to the line movement restrictions. So if you eventually you get out of the line there. A unit may not be moved into a hex which is the only hex adjacent to 2 enemy combat units. A unit may not be moved directly from one hex which is adjacent to 2 enemy combat units which are not adjacent to each other to another hex which is adjacent. So you can't run through the enemy there. I'm not sure about the other one. A unit may not be moved into a hex which is the only hex adjacent to 2 enemy combat units. To give an example, a unit in 3023 here's 3023. Let's put this thing. This is a special unit, a special rules unit in play. A unit in 3023 could not be moved into hex 3123 if there were enemy combat units in 3122 and 3124. Okay. They're trying to prevent you from penetrating the line with that rule, and I think they've also managed to cause another problem where you can't move into, say, this hex. Oh no, the only hex adjacent. So because this hex would have been adjacent to both units as well, it's if there's an every other line situation, you can't move into this hex. I had to puzzle that out because I couldn't understand that when I read it before. Terrain affects movement a little bit. We have some sloping going on here. That's the colors on the map. We have the woods. If the terrain's clear and dry, it costs a half movement point to move each hex. But in the historical scenario, most of the terrain is muddy, and that means it's going to cost 1 movement point to move each hex. Contour lines going uphill adds 1 movement point. And woods are prohibited to move into, although there is some suggestion that some of Henry's archers were in the woods. Now, what's the movement allowance on units? That's something I couldn't find. I see all kind of discussions about units spending their movement allowance in each impulse, but quite simply, I do not have a movement allowance that I've been able to find in this game. Maybe line movement terms and individual scenarios. I looked before and I couldn't find it, and I'm looking now and I can't find it. I don't know if there is one. I'm very disturbed if there... Oh, here we go. Summary of it. Okay. Charging cavalry and cavalry fugitives have an impulse movement allowance of 2. Everyone else has a 1. And there are special rules if you're talking about moving uphill, if you're non-charging units. That's unlikely to happen, but essentially you pause one move at the edge of the hill and then you move up it because you don't have enough movement points to make the hill completely. All right, well that was difficult to find. Let's look for other special rules here. Movement allowance is a special rule. Arrow retrieval. The English longbow units are able to spend an entire impulse flipped over on their yeoman side, which looks like a regular combat unit here, on top of dead bodies. I believe they have to be French dead bodies, but I don't know if that's clear whose they are from the game itself. I guess we could do it by facing. We just have dead markers. There aren't going to be a lot of English dead, though. And then they're allowed to pull how many? 2 volleys back. And you can pull an infinite amount of volleys from any dead. It's assumed that they're pincushions. Okay. Army morale. Each 5 game turns, the armies must undergo an army morale check. You look at the army casualty track. We're going to be keeping track of total dead here, or captured, I believe. And you roll... Where am I? That'll be the number of line step losses the army has suffered due to archery fire and melee combat. So I guess captures don't count. To check army morale, you consult the army casualty track to see the line step losses. The army morale table is then consulted over here. And we look at the number of casualties. We get a percent. If we reach that percentage, we have a break. And in all subsequent movement phases, the combat units of the demoralized army are routed, in which case they move directly away from the enemy units in the shortest path towards to the map edge that they started along, kind of. The only exception to this is if you begin the turn stacked with a leader who can command you. the English leaders can command anything. The French leaders are actually divided into some factions here that we have to deal with. The unit is considered in command and it can move freely and is not affected by loss of army morale until such a time as that leader is no longer stacked with you. So your army is mostly going to fade away. All you have left is what you can squat leaders on top of. Actual leaders have a melee rating, which is either used for melee strength of the unit and also during leader-to-leader combat. And they have a ransom value, which is going to affect their victory points. The ransom value is, I believe, the second number down there. Some of these leaders do not have a significant ransom. Each counter represents a historical leader. An English leader can use his abilities to any English unit. The French, except the constable, marshal, and admiral, have to be of the same contingent. And the contingent's covered by a little color marking on the units. Some are blue, some are black. But the three, the constable, marshal, and admiral, are all considered to be kind of non-noble professionals or something. They're all noble, but they're not just leading their noble contingent. They have greater importance, and they can lead anything. If a leader's in a stack which the combat unit is eliminated, the leader stays there until he retreats automatically with created fugitives. If he's retreating with friendly fugitives, he can't be moved normally during movement. He continues to retreat unless some unit saves him. If he retreats off the map, he's not considered captured, but he's also not going to come back and play. If an enemy combat unit enters his hex, the leader is captured and removed from play. Leaders can also be lost through leader-to-leader combat. Okay. Fugitives is one of the interesting things in this game. We already kind of know how they move and how they're created. And the interesting thing is that they can be captured, and we'll just score them in the pile because they count extra for victory points. Talked a little bit about yeomen. The yeomen, when the English convert to yeomen, they're able to fight like regular units, basically pulling out their hammers and schwacking Frenchmen over the head with them. What about cav? Cav charge. If a cav unit wants to charge, it can do this by flipping its counter at the beginning of the movement phase, or it can remain in charge status from the previous game turn. It must use its entire movement allowance unless it contacts the enemy. It must have moved at least one hex, though, to still charge. Once it begins a charge, it may not charge for more than 2 consecutive movement phases. And after it's charged, it has to rest for as many movement phases as it charged for. It cannot turn or cross a contour hex side into a lower terrain of elevation. It may charge across a contour hex side into a higher elevation. Now this is a big deal because the French are actually higher up than the English, and that's proving to be a disadvantage in this battle. They may not charge through fugitives. If they charge into a hex with dead, they must check their morale at the end of the impulse. This is in addition to any other morale checks that must be made for that unit. And I'm not sure how that works. Basically, is that just a penalty on their base morale check, or is it a second morale for that? And does it get penalized? I don't know. We have this Fate de Mort. This is, strangely enough, it's handled in Men of Iron's Agincourt as some French units that have even more restrictive rules than most of the Men of Iron Agincourt scenario. They basically just have to do some really dumb stuff. Here, they're not that. Here they're considered to be a small group of knights when the first French out to kill King Henry, when the first French combat unit is moved into a hex occupying Henry, it immediately gets the suicide squad, which is placed in the hex with the unit. This is used as a leader with a strength 4 combat rating in order to engage with the king. Now the king is a better leader than this, a better combat factor than this, and it doesn't seem to have any other effect. The French artillery can fire up to a range of 12 hexes. By the way, there's nowhere where it tells you where to set this up. In the free setup, it tells you, but in the historical game, there's nowhere it tells you, so I made a guess where to put it. Essentially, it has a 6% chance of hitting an English unit, and it can only fire every 6 turns. It cannot move. And it cannot fire over friendly or enemy units. You know, I didn't go too much into fire combat. I'm realizing one thing that I didn't talk about is what you can fire at, what kind of line of sight rules there are. You have to fire all your fire at the same unit, so if you fire multiple volleys, it's all at one unit. If a French combat unit is in a hex which is adjacent to an English combat unit, only the closest English archer can fire at it. If more than one archer is equidistant, then they can all fire. More than one archer can fire at a target unit, however each attack is resolved individually. Line of sight. You cannot fire at something that you can't observe, but the only blocking terrain, I think, is the woods. Elevation can block, but that's going to be, you're only going to see that, say, from here to over there or something. I'm looking because I know that there's a unit issue here, and that doesn't seem to be under the line of sight rules. Yeah, I'm not finding it. It's probably back in the basic rules for archery. If you fire any archer units during an impulse, you must fire them all that have an enemy within range. You can never fire through a woods hex. You may fire over enemy or friendly combat units, except crossbows cannot. But that changes the range by increasing it by 1 when you're firing over a unit. Now, the problem with that is, no, okay. You're not allowed to increase your rate of fire for the range. So like a longbow here, at range 1 would get a 35% chance of hitting if it fires all 3 volleys. But it would get a range impediment if it was firing at 2 hexes, and that would actually lower its rate of its ability to hit, because the rate of fire is being cut down. Well, it's not being cut down in that case, but if I was moving from 2 to 3 hexes, it's 31% chance with 3 volleys. Well, it's down to 26% on 3 hexes, but I could, if it was really 3 hexes, fire at a higher rate of volley, rate of fire. So that's how they handled that. And I think that's about it, except for the scenario and the victory conditions, which, like I said, there's multiple scenarios here. This book, the rules come with basically a full magazine's worth of the magazine article size historical summary from Nafi, and then, wow, a really impressive set of designer's notes. It's only a page and a half. Modern terms, that's not an unreasonable size of designer notes, but boy does he pack it in. It's not like, oh, I had to think about balancing the cards and that's tricky, and then I had trouble getting the rules proofed and I had to change this order. Really, really nicely done designer's notes. Actually, he had the developer ask him specific questions of why this is designed this way. So rather than being kind of a biographical designer's notes, which are useful, this one really focuses in on why is this way? Why is this way? It misses some questions that I would have had, but it definitely helps pinpoint some things that you might say, gee, that's kind of weird. Okay, for the historical scenario, everything's fixed deployment except for that I have no idea where it's supposed to do. Go. The ground is muddy, which means movement point costs are going to be 1. I saw the Battlefield Detectives show where they went into why Agincourt was what it was, and that Henry basically had himself set up in a place where the French were actually funneled by the terrain into these killing fields. Now, this game kind of forces that in this scenario, and we'll see that. But in the free deployment scenario, if you assume the French don't have to attack, they're not going to be forced into that situation. And the French didn't have to attack. The English moved forward and unleashed arrows at them. Okay. During the French, before the French player turn begins, the English are going to be able to fire at least one volley at the frontline cav units. In fact, they must, and this is going to trigger the charge. During the first French player turn, the frontline cavalry, and only that, may be moved. It must charge at its full movement allowance towards the English line in the impulses. On the next game turn, the French cav must continue the charge, and the French front line must move forward. On the third game turn, the French archers must move forward. On the fourth game turn, the French second line must move forward. Once a French unit has begun to advance, it must be moved forward towards the English line at full movement allowance, continuously in accordance with the rules governing movement, with the following exceptions. French archers are never forced to crowd with other units. They may move laterally in that situation. And French archers which are within short bow or crossbow range of an English unit may stand and fire instead of moving forward. French archers must be checked for morale at the end of the movement phase, if there are enough morale points present that there is the possibility they'll take a step loss. Retreat from the battle as per the fugitive rules, beginning with the subsequent fugitive movement phase. So basically, if the French archers have to make a morale check, they fail it en masse. If they have any chance of even losing one row, one line, they fail it en masse from movement melee, movement morale check. And then they give rules for the leader combat. Basically, you roll a die for the French leaders' actions. Now, the victory points, the French get 7 victory points for each English line step loss, 4 times the ransom value of English knights, and 2 times the value for 2 times the number of English fugitives they capture. For the English, they get the same victory points they'll get under the free setup, which is 1 for each casualty point they cause, 1 for each ransom point of French leaders, and 1 for each point of fugitives that they capture. Now, fugitives is kind of a cool thing. You might say, well, wait a minute, fugitive capturing units counts the same as killing them? Not exactly, because when you hit a unit, if you cause casualties, you also cause fugitives, so the fugitives are an opportunity to get an extra point. But there are times when only fugitives happen, and then yes, your capture costs is worth less than, or worth the same as killing some of the units in a line. The other scenarios, the Harry's Folly, means the English actually kind of have to attack. In fact, the French are not allowed to attack until they're move until they're fired upon. And then they're forced to fire. So basically what happens with this one is the English are going to have to move forward and shoot at the French to force them to move forward on a one-by-one basis. You're not going to get this mass charge that you get. And part of this game, the crowding rules, etc., mean that having everyone come forward at once is actually worse than only sending a couple of units forward at a time, which seems kind of counterintuitive. All right, let's send this up and see what we get. We got a nice long video here that probably is going to be in 2 parts.